Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Emily Wigmore. I'm a sophomore at Rutland High School in Rutland, Vermont, and I'd like to welcome you to our 7th annual Global Issues Network conference. This year, we're holding a modified and virtual conference due to the global pandemic and school closures. However, we would still not be able to carry on in this current climate without our dedicated and forward-thinking IT department. So, I'd like to take a moment to thank our Director of Technology, Patricia Agner, who will be hosting and managing this webinar for us this morning. Thanks, Ms. Agner.
Thank you for your kind words. I want to recognize our faculty with special thanks to Marcia Castle and Erica Wallstrom for their huge lift in producing the GEN conference online. I am not aware of any other school in the United States or abroad going to this effort to provide the GEN conference opportunity to students. In fact, all of our educators are working tirelessly to provide a high quality and engaging education to all of our students. Thank you again, and thank you to our students and their parents for doing their part too. Thank you, families, kids, and teachers.
Whether you are joining us via the webinar, YouTube channel, or via Facebook Live, we're glad that you have tuned in. The Global Issues Network conferences around the world, which are frequently referred to by the acronym GIN Conference, explore how we can and must come together to solve the world's most pressing problems. There's perhaps no greater example of a pressing global issue than the one we all face now: how to fight a highly infectious disease that has swiftly become a pandemic, threatening us, and in too many cases, killing us and completely disrupting our lives. Coincidentally, at our 2017 GIN conference entitled Contagion, we focused on infectious diseases. We spoke then in the context of Ebola, Zika, SARS, and MERS, cholera, and various strains of influenza, because that's what we knew at the time. Nevertheless, the conversations we had in our global villages were about how to minimize suffering and how to distribute finite resources in the midst of a deadly crisis. We all had thoughtful debates and uncomfortable conversations about what we would do as leaders in a hypothetical emergency, and now this challenge is actually happening. As students, we may not be able to be people in charge of managing the responses to this serious threat yet, but we will be in those positions soon. And in the meantime, there is plenty that we can do to help in our own communities. Our legacy will be to promote cross-cultural understanding, communication, and cooperation in order to avert similar situations in the future, and to share our learning for the greater good. So here we are, trying to do these very things, wherever we are, whoever we are. The spirit of the Global Issues Network is as important as ever. Thanks for joining this broadcast this morning. Now, I'd like to invite my friend Bella to join me to explain more about today.
Thanks, Emily. I'm Isabella LaFemina, and I'm also a sophomore at RHS, and I'm pleased to co-moderate our event today. The purpose of the Global Issues Network is to nurture and mobilize transgenerational communities of global citizens to build an equitable and sustainable world. The GIN conferences strive to empower young people to collaborate locally, regionally, and globally in order to create project-based sustainable solutions for our shared global issues. There are 20+ topics identified by the International Global Issues Network, and there are 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which complement the GIN topics. We are offering just shy of 50 breakout sessions, pre-recorded and linked on our conference website, that address these issues and goals. In addition to the breakout sessions, we always have a focusing theme. We have focused on sustainable energy, climate change, human migration, with a particular emphasis on refugees, infectious diseases, education for all, and artificial intelligence. This year's theme is equity. Thus, our conference's subtitles, GINclusivity. We were initially inspired by the idea that the fact that 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of American women's right to vote. It's hard to believe that it took that long, and longer in reality for women of color. And of course, there are still places in the world where women and girls struggle for similar agency and power. However, we wanted to expand our scope and advocacy to address not only traditional gender inequities, but also to include the rights of other marginalized groups, such as the LGBTQ+ community, racial inequities, ethnic inequities, with a particular reference to refugees and immigrants, the rights of the disabled, and to address the digital divide, otherwise known as the gap between those who have and do not have access and reliable and affordable technology and internet. The digital divide has become keenly evident in our local, national, and international efforts to move learning to online platforms. COVID-19 has magnified pre-existing inequities.
In past years, our conference looked very different. Our keynote speaker would be addressing us, delivered in a crowded gymnasium with lots of musical fanfare and energy and activity. Some of you would head off afterward to participate in hands-on surface learning in the community. Others of us would proceed to the numerous diverse breakout sessions, enjoy a mindful vegetarian meal, and perhaps visit some of the tables and booths set up by our partner agencies and school-based clubs.
Obviously, we've had to scale back a bit this year, but we've managed to preserve some key elements of our conference. An inspiring keynote address, pre-recorded breakout sessions linked on our conference website, online meetings where there will be student-facilitated Global Village discussion groups, and several calls to action.
Before we welcome our guests, there are some important things you need to know. We're going to run through today's schedule, which we are now screen sharing with you. This document has been also shared with all Rutland students through their school emails. Outside guests can also find this information at our GIN website, https://globalissuesnetwork.org/Rutland2020 /. Once the opening ceremony ends, you will have about a 30-minute stretch break. At 10:30 a.m., you will have a choice between two options. You can join the live Implicit Bias training webinar hosted by our keynote speaker, Laurie Yang, or you can watch 3 or more breakout sessions which are pre-recorded and they can be found at the 2020 GIN website. Both options have live hyperlinks included in the GIN schedule that we are currently reviewing. At 2 p.m., all Rutland students will be joining a pre-assigned Global Village. You should have received an email from an RHS teacher inviting you to a Google Hangout meeting. If you have not received an invitation, please email Ms. Wigmore at jennifer.wigmore@rcpsvt.org. Please join your village promptly at 2 p.m.
We are so lucky to have this unifying school-wide event. Participation is required for all students. In order to receive credit for your attendance, you must complete the Google Form exit ticket at the end of the day. A link to the exit ticket will be shared with you during your Global Village. An additional link to the exit ticket can be found at the bottom of the agenda for the day that we viewed, which can be found on the GIN conference website. Throughout the day, we encourage you to share your positive experiences on our Twitter feed at #VTGin. Our Twitter handle is @VermontGin.
Now that we have shared some of the logistics for the day, we're going to move on with our opening ceremony. I would like to welcome Holden Champagne and Maddie Pomeroy from Rutland Middle School to introduce some of our honored guests.
We are so fortunate to have a couple of dignitaries joining us today. I am honored to introduce Ryan McLaren joining us today on behalf of Representative Peter Welch. Thank you, Mr. McLaren, for speaking and spending your time with us today.
Thank you, Holden, and thank you everyone that's tuning in, and to the Rutland folks that put this on. It's really an amazing event. It's been doing nothing but Zoom calls lately, and this is the biggest one I've been on so far, so congrats. And you know, I think it's a bit odd to be talking to you about a global issues conference from my bedroom, but it is so important now. I think, Bella, you pointed out that the pandemic we're all living through is really holding a magnifying glass to the societal issues and inequities we see. It does not affect all of us equally. And so the conversations you're having today, paired with the conversations you've had over the years at this conference, including your pandemic conversation a few years ago, are really, really important to all of us in thinking about how we walk out of this crisis in a way that makes our society, our government better and stronger for the next time this happens. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here, to listen in and learn from you all. And I really wish you a really amazing conference. Thank you.
Thank you for taking time out of your regular schedule to share with us your message from Representative Welch.
We are so fortunate to also have a representative from Senator Sanders' office, Katerina Zayas, has joined many of our previous conferences, and we are so pleased that she's able to join us again this year for our virtual conference through the phone line. I would like to welcome Katerina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who has planned this and all of the students putting in extra hours to help make this this virtual conference work this year. So thank you for letting me share a few words on behalf of Senator Sanders. I applaud your ingenuity, your hard work, and your talent to pull off this year's conference during a global pandemic. I will be honest that it doesn't surprise me that Rutland High School is still pulling this off after attending GIN conferences in the past. And it is making clear that the purpose of the GIN conference is to build tools to think globally and act locally. This is now true more than ever, just as our MCs and Ryan just said. Each and every one of you needs to be involved with what we want our world to look like. This year's theme of equity and inclusivity could not better prepare you for what we have all experienced in these last 6 or more weeks. Our worlds are flipped upside down, and Senator Sanders has said ever since we've talked with him about what's going on with the COVID crisis, that this is an opportunity, that we are reinventing how and what we deliver in education, in our communities, across the state, country, and world. And in that, it has been made clear that there are greater inequities in our society, whether it's not being able to afford or have internet, as Bella just said, whether it's when you lose your job, you also lose your health insurance during a health pandemic, or still not being able to find enough food to eat. When we create these new deliveries, when we think about this as an opportunity, we must be inclusive, which is why I'm thrilled that is your theme this year. We have time and time again left people out of how we build our systems, and we need to think about how we include everyone. So Senator Sanders would just like to extend to use the skills that you are learning today to better prepare every member in your community for a better future. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the conference this year.
Thank you for attending today and bringing encouraging words from Senator Sanders' office during this difficult time.
If I could just jump in, Bella, I just want to tell folks we are having a little glitch with our YouTube live feed. So if you have friends trying to use that platform, you might want to redirect them to the Facebook page.
Thank you. I would now like to invite RHS Senior Maya Sobel to introduce our keynote speaker for today.
Hello. We are pleased to welcome Laurie Yang as our keynote speaker for the Rutland High School 2020 Global Issues Network Conference. Laurie Yang serves as the Executive Director and Legal Counsel for the Vermont Human Rights Commission, where she investigates claims of discrimination in Vermont. She joined the commission in 2015 as a staff attorney to investigate claims of discrimination in housing, state government employment, and places of public accommodations. She completed her BA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her Juris Doctor from the University of Minnesota Law School. Before moving to Vermont, Laurie Yang was a college instructor in a legal studies program and practiced law in the areas of family, government, and Social Security benefits, representing clients and victims of domestic violence. One of her top priorities in her career is to address systemic racism. Today, she will be helping us to unpack implicit bias and to understand our own blind spots through her expertise both during her keynote and training session. Laurie Yang will be hosting another live webinar session starting at 10:30 for anyone who is interested in deeper exploration of this complex topic. This session is open to anybody who would like to participate. The live link to this breakout session can be found on the schedule, which is posted on our GIN website. Throughout her address, we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A feature on the webinar page. For those of you who are tuning in through our Facebook live feed, there is a link to a Google form where you can submit questions. Laurie Yang will answer as many questions as time allows at the end of her keynote. I am so pleased to have the opportunity to welcome Laurie Yang on behalf of the entire Rutland High School and Middle School community.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thank you to everyone at the GIN conference for putting this together and for inviting me to be here today. What a bizarre time that we are living in right now. I was in the grocery store the other day with my mask on, and I felt a tickle in my throat and I needed to clear it. And I was holding it in because I knew how it was going to sound. And then I coughed and everyone turned around to look at me. And as I left the grocery store, I felt myself just thinking and feeling kind of uncomfortable about the situation and wondering if that cough sounded worse because it was coming from me, an Asian American. We're hearing stories right now around COVID-19 and about hate crimes against Asian Americans across the country. We're seeing fear turn to hate right here in Vermont. People here locally are turning against who we consider to be outsiders, people who are coming here to shelter in their second homes. When schools shut down, we were worried about kids going hungry and being abused or neglected at home. We're recognizing now the amount of burden that we have put on our schools to care for our children, to feed them, to love them, to teach them. As we turn to online learning, and this was mentioned by several people today, that we're recognizing that some students don't have internet access or they don't have computers at home, that parents are out of work, and that some parents are essential workers and they're still going to work and they don't have daycare for their children. We're seeing just how much people really need that stimulus check. Inequity and injustices, it's everywhere. We're hearing a lot about it at the Vermont Human Rights Commission as well. And for those of you who don't know, the Human Rights Commission is a state entity that is charged with promoting full civil and human rights in Vermont. And I'm the executive director and legal counsel for that commission. We protect people from unlawful discrimination in three primary areas: housing, state government employment, and places of public accommodations. And places of public accommodations includes hospitals, prisons, roads, schools, businesses, any office or establishment that provides goods and services to the general public. And I want to spend some time today telling you a little bit about myself and how I came to do this work at the commission. And I want to start that with talking about something I heard from the great Governor Madeline Kunin, who I once heard speak at an equity conference. She said, "It isn't that we cannot find men who care about women's issues. Of course we can. They're out there. But when they get into office, they face many competing demands and priorities and issues. And the things that matter to us as women might fall lower on that list of priorities. And I truly believe that. Our personal experiences, our travels, our communities, how the world has received us, defined and categorized us, what opportunities we've had or had to fight for or been wrongfully denied from enjoying, all of these things, they inform the work that we do. So it was not lost upon me that when I became the executive director, I was bringing to this position all of my experiences as a refugee and immigrant, being a person of color, being a person with a disability, being a woman, being a parent, being someone who had been poor most of my life. 3 years ago, I found myself back in Laos, the country where I was born. And I was sitting at the Mekong River with my nephews at sunset. This is the river that divides Thailand from Laos. And it was wide and it was low and dry that evening. And I could see patches of grass separating Laos from Thailand. The last time that I was in front of this river was before I could form any memories, almost 40 years ago. And what I'm about to share with you is my family's story and how I came to be here today. During the Vietnam War, there was a secret war in Laos, and the CIA had recruited young men like my father, grandfather, and uncles to fight this war with the promise that if all was lost in the end, we'd be welcomed in the United States. When that war came to an abrupt end, we were deserted without notice, provisions, or any means of escape. When my uncle returned with the news that the Americans had left the country, our family faced a very real dilemma. We could stay in our home country and continue to fight a losing war, or cross the jungles of Laos by foot, cross the Mekong River to Thailand in search of refuge. At this point, my father, uncles, grandfather were really threats to the Lao communist government. The idea that they could just spend years in warfare, then walk out of the jungles, place their weapons at their feet, and throw up their hands and white flags, and somehow re-enter society peacefully was just not very realistic or safe. And some families did make the decision to stay in the jungles of Laos, and they remained there today. Once they were soldiers for the CIA, today they're considered terrorists. I was less than 2 years old when my family decided we would escape to Thailand. My right leg was paralyzed by the polio virus the previous year. I was no longer able to walk. My mother carried me on her back. My father carried supplies and rice and supervised my older sister, who was around 7 at the time and was able to walk on her own. My other sister, around age 5, she was accompanied by my grandparents and 2 aunts, and who were not much older than her. We traveled with extended family and others from the same troop, and we traveled in large groups so that families could share information and supplies and provide each other support. But there was also this crippling fear that we would be discovered and that we would be killed. So parents were pressured to give their infants opium to sedate them. When some of these babies died from the overdose, these parents mourned their greatest loss in complete silence. There are many heartbreaking stories of death and loss from this time. When our group neared the Mekong River, they strategized how they would cross at night. Being a mountainous people, no one knew how to swim. They used plastic and whatever they had as makeshift flotation devices. They taught each other how to stay afloat, but there was no certainty, and there would only be one trial. The river was heavily guarded by the Pathet Lao soldiers who were shooting anyone crossing it. My mother said that the night before they were going to cross, she could not sleep because she could hear gunshots all night. The Mekong River raged the night my mother and I crossed it. It was in complete darkness. The sky and the ground was lit up only by the rapid fire of gunshots. Years later, my father would describe in detail the image of bullets propelling blades of grass before him. At the river, my mother watched the current carry people away until they disappeared. It was complete chaos, hundreds of families crossing at the same time. Faces and bodies, no more than shadows. Everyone was a stranger, indistinguishable. My mother called up to a God she did not know existed at the time. And then she blew air into the bags. She tied them up and then she put them under her arms. With me on her back, she looked ahead, determined to kick her legs until they either failed her or she could feel ground beneath her. We did make it to the Thai refugee camps, but we had been lost for days and we had lost our other family members who had also crossed the Mekong River. My father and sister believed that we were dead and vice versa. And my grandparents, aunts, and 5-year-old sister had been captured by soldiers and detained. Later, my father would ask for money from an uncle who had already arrived in the United States for money. And when he received it, he was able to bribe some Laotian soldiers to release my grandparents, aunts, and sister. We lived in the Thai refugee camps for a few months until we were sponsored by an agency in Chicago. And in America, it was a difficult adjustment. My parents had post-traumatic stress disorder. They described hearing cars backfire and thinking they were in a war again. They slept on the hard floors until they got used to mattresses. And once we lived in villages with extended families, here in the United States, we were separated from them by hundreds of miles. We lived in Chicago's poorest neighborhood. Prostitutes loitered the street in front of our high-rise, and my father was robbed and beaten in the park. One of my only pictures from my childhood is of my father holding me next to my 2 sisters. And in the background is an old stained mattress and window frames with cracked paint. Later, when I became a parent and we were renting and buying, we realized that those cracked paint were signs of lead. When public assistance was insufficient to support a family of 9, my parents went to work as laborers and machine operators and then farmers. All 9 of us lived in a 3-bedroom apartment before they bought their first house in Minneapolis for $64,000. And our neighborhood was made up of refugees from Southeast Asia, African Americans, and Mexican immigrants. Growing up, we shared a small set of school supplies, a single packet of pencils and pens for all 7 of us. At the beginning of the school year, we each received 2 outfits, which had to last us the rest of the year. I wore winter coats that were donated from the school. And for Christmas, my parents wrapped up free toys they received from a charity. When it was time to go to college, I studied for the ACT using a book that I borrowed from the school library. I had no idea that preparatory courses were even available. But even if I had known, I would not have been able to afford them. I went to college on scholarships and financial aid. Then I went to law school, clerked for an amazing judge who was a former EEOC senior attorney. And then I worked at Central Minnesota Legal Services. And then I taught at a community college and practiced part-time before I moved here to Vermont. My husband had gone to college in Vermont and he really wanted to come back to the Green Mountains. And it was it seemed like a great time to try something new. And so I agreed. And I mentioned earlier that I had polio when I was younger. My right leg is shorter and smaller than my left leg. I walk with a crutch and a brace. And for the majority of my life, I refused to let my disability stop me from becoming educated, becoming an attorney, a wife and mom, from traveling and kayaking and skiing. And I've never asked for a reasonable accommodation, but now I know that I did receive those accommodations as a child. At first, a few years ago, I took an implicit bias test, and it said that I had an implicit bias in favor of able-bodied people. And that really surprised me. And I really kind of rejected that idea. But when I started to examine why that would be the case, it really made a lot of sense. I had spent most of my life rejecting my disability. Being a person with a disability did not make me inherently sensitive to people with disabilities. This is a blind spot for me, and I have others. I'm straight, I'm cisgender, I don't have any mental health issues, and while I'm a person of color, I'm not Black. Until COVID-19, people were not consciously or unconsciously afraid of me, and I got to navigate this world unafraid of the police. I'm from a two-parent household, two parents who were incredibly resilient, supportive, positive, and completely aligned on my educational goals. So I know that despite all of my experiences, there are many experiences that I have not had. And as the head of an agency that is charged with protecting Vermont's most vulnerable, I have to be willing to confront these blind spots without being defensive on a continuous basis. And today, I ask you all to do the same, to be introspective, to not be defensive, and to be willing to look at your blind spots as well. I started this speech with some of the pretty sad things that are happening across the country and here in Vermont. But I also want to say that I have been incredibly encouraged. We are seeing people rise up and speak up out against hate and prejudice. We're seeing communities come together to feed each other, to shop for one another. We are realizing that it's okay to limit store hours to people who are aging or who have disabilities. That it wasn't such a burden after all to cater to people door to door. It turns out people can work from home and be productive. And had we recognized this earlier, our workplaces could have been more open to people with disabilities and parents with young children. We have to realize that our ways are flexible and we are nimble, and we are recognizing that now. And we are forgiving of each other as we make mistakes and learn together. There are many young people who are listening here today. Thank you for tuning in. What you are seeing and experiencing and doing right now is going to shape who you become in the future. Someone once said, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. Take note of what is happening. Be kind, be compassionate, but most importantly, be unafraid. I am looking forward to seeing who you become and the better and more equitable world that you will bring forth. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bor Yang. We would like to ask participants to take this opportunity to ask questions of Bor Yang using the Q&A feature. Emily will answer the first question.
So someone asked, did your family often retell stories about leaving, or did they try to forget the experience?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. They do tell the stories, and part of telling the stories over and over really is healing. And so these are all stories that we grew up, and when we meet with other families as well, they share their stories also. And over many years of sharing those same stories, it has truly been a very healing process. While it was an incredibly harrowing and traumatic experience, I would say that overall my parents have demonstrated, and our family in general have demonstrated, incredible resiliency, and they are incredibly happy and jolly people.
Thank you. The next question says, how much of your recollection is based on personal memories and how much on family stories?
Sure. All of the crossing of everything that happened in Laos, except for my recent trip, is based on several stories from my mom, my dad, my grandparents, and some of my aunts and my oldest sister. And all of the stories from Chicago on are mine.
Somebody's wondering, what does people of color mean?
Sure, yeah. So racial, ethnic minorities, sometimes we hear the term minorities, but minorities can also be used to describe other groups of people, but interchangeably.
So another person asked, how have you dealt with your able-bodied bias since you found out you have one?
Sure. That is a really great question. And as was mentioned earlier, I will be teaching a section on implicit bias at 10:30. And I would love for all of you to tune in if you're interested in learning more about implicit bias and how to counteract it. But to answer your question quickly, one, you have to be aware of it. And two, you have to be conscious of it. And so part of how we deal with any of our biases is, one, to maintain conversations about it and to be consciously aware of it. And if someone calls it out, to not be defensive, but to ask yourself many times. So for example, if I am reviewing a complaint and I go, is this potentially unlawful or not? And let's say the complaint is about someone with a disability. I'm a lawyer, so I'm looking at the legal analysis, but I will check that with someone else in the office to make sure that they also see that as well. Likewise, if you were hiring and you had any kind of biases, you want to make sure that how you feel about someone isn't just based on your gut, but that you have concrete reasons why you like someone or prefer someone, or why you may not like someone as much. And then you want to test that against other people on that hiring committee and team as well. And also, the more we engage with people who are different from us, the more likely we can mitigate those implicit biases also.
Thank you. How is implicit bias used in the courtroom?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And again, I might defer you to the implicit bias training later on as well. But I would say that right now, it isn't used. It isn't used. There have been some studies that have shown that jurors who are instructed about implicit bias are more likely to deliberate longer and therefore reduce their implicit bias. But we don't currently have any sort of procedure or process in place to instruct jurors about implicit bias. And so yes, it isn't used in any sort of formal way. Our judiciary has been very proactive, and they have all taken implicit bias trainings, which is great. But we have a lot more to go.
Some say that more men of color are in prison. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we do have a disproportionate not just men of color, but also men who identify as Hispanic and men who are African American are disproportionately represented in our prison system. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And is it because judges and jurors are racist? Is it because of implicit bias? Is it because of lack of opportunities? Or is it because of something else? And I would say that we have a lot of evidence that there is significant society, a lot of people in society have implicit bias against African Americans, and that does explain sort of that disproportionate representation in our jails and our prisons. These are all really great questions. Thank you for asking them.
Could you tell us about the tests you can take about implicit bias?
Yeah, so the Harvard implicit bias test is the most popular, and also the one where a lot of social studies and experiments have resulted from. And so all you have to do is Google Harvard Implicit Bias. There's a series of tests that you can take. And so I would highly encourage that you do that, especially if you're interested in learning more about it. In fact, it was a few years ago when I was teaching that I was flying somewhere and I was reading an article about this music, I think it was a movie producer who had taken an implicit bias test. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I'm teaching and I have so much discretion as a teacher. If someone says I was sick and I missed the assignment or I missed the exam, I have complete discretion to decide whether to give that to them or not. Or how I grade someone, whether someone gets the A- or the B+, I have a ton of discretion in that sense. And so I thought, you know what, I should really take this test and figure out. And so it was really out of just curiosity. And so I went to the Harvard Implicit Bias website and I took it. And that's where I was really surprised. So I took the race one and I took other ones as well. There's one on Asian Americans. And then when I took the one about disability, I was really surprised to see the results. And my initial reaction to it, as I mentioned, was, but I've been dealing with this for a really long time, and I've been reading up on it, and I've been teaching it. And I think the most important thing is to recognize that we all have biases. In fact, anyone who says that they don't, that is in fact problematic. We really do. It's just a matter of figuring out what yours may be and not being defensive and being willing to see them and address them. And it's not your fault. You're not a bad person because you have biases. Again, we all have them. It's part of, and I'll talk a little bit about this during the implicit bias training too, but biases is a natural part of our lives. It is part of how we function in the world. We have biases around dogs. We have bias of which dog you like. We have biases around the vehicles. These things are all a very natural part of our brain function. But we have to recognize that sometimes we are unconsciously judging people even though we don't want to consciously do that and we don't mean to do that. And so we need to connect our unconscious thoughts and reasoning with what we really do believe about the world consciously. And that's the importance of recognizing the implicit bias. Not to condemn anybody or make anybody feel bad or to say you're ill-equipped or incompetent if you have biases. We all have them. The key is to recognize them.
We have another question. This one is asking about Asian bias. Do you think a certain stigma will be present after the coronavirus is over?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's possible. I think it depends on a lot of things. It depends on how we react to the stigma that we're seeing. So how did the stigma happen in the first place? Well, you know, there were individuals who had called it the Chinese virus, and because of where it started. And fear often leads us to hate because when we're scared, we want to connect to the things that are similar. And so anything that feels like it is different from that or outside, we want to separate ourselves from that. And so oftentimes what happens is when we're really scared, we go, you're from New York, or you look like you might be from China. I don't know if you are or not, but that scares me. And so you might have it. And that's usually what is happening. I do think that the louder we are as the opposition to that kind of hate and bias, that the shorter the time frame would be for how we see that. But it usually takes a while before that kind of hate and discrimination sort of mitigates in our society.
What attracted you to the legal field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I grew up and I think I've always kind of been an advocate for people and an advocate for myself, and it just seemed like a really good fit. And also, I like to talk a lot. And then someone once said, "Hey, maybe you should try that." And the more I thought about it, the more I realized, hey, I really do enjoy this. I like learning the law, and I like advocating on behalf of people. But having said that, I also think that I could have been an advocate in many different ways. I could have been an advocate through journalism. I could have been an advocate through teaching. I could have been an advocate through art. And so there isn't any one way in which people can be an advocate. And I think this is was my path, but I also think that I could have done other things as well. So.
How do you, what role does social media play in perpetuating bias?
Yeah, so both the media and social media, one of the things that we have seen is that when the virus, at least in terms of COVID-19, at least when the virus started, we would see images of people who looked Asian American, even though the article itself would be about someone locally who had the virus or who was diagnosed with the virus, or that when you read the article, you wouldn't even know who had it. You wouldn't even know the national origin or the identity of the person who was diagnosed with the virus. And so sometimes the media does this thing where they're quick to put out a heading or pictures or something to be attractive to get readership. And in doing so, they put misinformation out there. We see that happening regarding people who are African American. We see that happening in terms of gender as well. It's sort of this, we see that with when there's an incident, we see them quickly using the term terrorism when they think that the suspects are a racial minority. And even before the police have identified it as being a terrorist attack, we see the media putting that language out there already. And when the suspect is white, we sometimes see, oh, mental health issue or something else like that, which by the way is pretty bad too. So the media is very quick to put information out there. And the media are also made up of people who also have biases also.
Is implicit bias training important for any field or for some more than others?
I think it's important for all of us because most of us work in a field where we have discretion and we come across different groups of people. So it's important for teachers, it's important for administrators in a school, it's important for kids as well. It's important for people like me, but it's also important for all of our legislators. It's important for our governor. It's important for really everyone. And it's also extremely important for the media too.
How do you deal with microaggressions every day? Snubs, nonverbal cues. How can I respond without hurting back?
That's a really great question. I'm glad that you brought that up. So microaggressions are these verbal and sometimes nonverbal statements or behaviors that indicate something negative about a different group of people. So for an example of a microaggression is someone saying to me, "Hey, where are you from? You're not from here, are you?" That's an example of a microaggression. There's an assumption that I must not be from Vermont or that I must not be from the United States because of the way that I look. And that happens to be true. I happen to move here from Minnesota and I was born in a different country, but I've also pretty much grown up in the United States and I do consider myself an American. And that statement is made to a lot of racial minorities who are from here. and from Vermont as well. So that's an example of a microaggression. Another microaggression that I hear as a person with a disability is, "You are so brave." So for example, I'll give you an example. I'm a mom, and one time I was at the park with my daughter and I was pushing her on the swing, and then I was just standing back, and this other parent came up to me, and she was a complete stranger, and she said, "You are just so brave. You are so amazing." And I remember just thinking, I wasn't doing anything. I was just pretty much standing there. And so the reason why, even though that sounds nice and that sounds neutral, the reason why someone would say you're so brave and you're so amazing is because the expectation of someone with a disability is so low that we're so surprised that someone with a disability is so capable of being a parent. And that's the negative message that we send. And it is really hard to respond to that when you are the person receiving the microaggression. And oftentimes what I say is, when we are the victim, so to speak, of the microaggression, it can be very hard for us to stand up for ourselves because we have an emotional response to that. And so it's important for everyone, whether you are the recipient of the microaggression or not, to really speak out against microaggressions when you hear it. So for example, when someone says, "Hey, where are you from?" It would be really great if someone said, I could either respond to that and go, "I'm from here. Why makes you ask that?" Or someone who's next to me could go, "Where are you from?" And so there are different ways that we can sort of respond to it. And also there's no perfect way to respond to microaggressions. And so if you have an emotional response to something, and you're not good at dealing with it in the moment, like me, sometimes I'll sleep on it and I'll write an email and I'll say, "Hey, yesterday during our conversation, you said this, and it gave me this really funny feeling. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about it. Are you willing to do that?" And I think that that's a way to address microaggressions as well. But going back to the question, which was, how do you do it without hurting their feelings? Well, I don't think that worrying about whether it hurts someone's feelings is the priority. I think addressing the microaggression takes priority over hurting the person's feelings, because they've just hurt yours too. But having said that, there are many ways to deal with it where it doesn't have to be confrontational. You don't have to say, "I think that's implicit bias. I think that's microaggression." But if you did, that would be okay. I completely accept that. I just also think that you can send an email and you can say, "Why do you ask that?" Or "Where's that question coming from?" And there are nice ways to do that as well. So thank you.
And our
I have
last,
time for a few more questions if you all want.
okay, our next question is, how has your gender affected your work?
I think I sort of mentioned earlier that I think all of our experiences inform the work that we do. And being a woman and being a mom particularly sort of makes me really sensitive to cases that come before us sometimes regarding sex discrimination and sexual harassment and equal pay. And so part of my job as the executive director is also to push policies at the legislature. So when bills come up, my job is to testify in favor of them or against them if I think that they're bad. And there have been some bills that address sexual harassment in the workplace, and some bills that address equal pay for women in the workplace. And I feel like my experience as a woman has really given me the motivation and the personal experiences to really try to persuade our legislature to move those bills forward that I think are good for all women and all persons, truly.
I would like to say thank you. We thank you so much for sharing your experiences and thoughts about implicit bias. On behalf of the Rutland community, we would like to extend our collective thanks. You have a chance to continue the conversation with Laurie Yang during her live breakout session at 10:30 a.m. I would also like to mention that our live stream is now back up on our YouTube channel. Again, you can find the registration for that session on the day's agenda on our conference page.
Another option for students is to visit our GIN website and view 3 or more of our pre-recorded breakout sessions. Regardless of whether you are attending the live stream or viewing pre-recorded sessions, make sure that if you are an RHS student, you are ready to join your Global Village at 2 p.m.
We want to thank all of you for being a part of this modified framework for our 2020 GIN conference. There may be challenges that we each face as we navigate through this technology. If you have any questions during the day, feel free to message Mrs. Wigmore at jennifer.wigmore@rcpsvt.org. We appreciate your presence and participation in this unprecedented journey. Your voice and your ideas are what make this conference so powerful. As you proceed through the day, notice examples of inequities and inequalities. Think about how the systems around us support or obstruct the progress of others every day.
When we come together, we are powerful and can influence change and make a difference. Thank you for logging in. You are now free to take a quick break before moving on to your sessions.